Hello and welcome to this interview where I am joined by Dr. Andrew Loke to discuss the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Dr. Andrew Loke is an associate professor at the Baptist University of Hong Kong and is elected fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion. He has recently had contributions to the fields of the teleological argument, the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Dr. Andrew Loke, thank you very much for coming onto the channel. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Wonderful. So to get started, before we delve into the Kalam Cosmological Argument, let's start off with the broader question in general. What are cosmological arguments and how did they develop into the Kalam Cosmological Argument?
The cosmological arguments is a family of arguments. There are different versions of it, and what they try to show is that there is a first cause or a necessary being that explains the existence of all other things, right? And so there are different versions of these arguments. Now, we find the very first formulation in the writings of Plato, and it was also later developed by Aristotle, and later on, a Christian philosopher by the name of John Philoponus. He was the first one to try to develop a temporal version, right, of the cosmological argument, which tries to show that there is a first cause of time. And this was later developed by the Muslim philosophers. And so it became known as the Kalam. And this is distinct, right, from other versions, such as, for example, the Thomistic version, which was developed by Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. And Aquinas tries to show that there is a first cause which sustains things in existence. So what Aquinas tries to prove, right, is not so much a first cause of time, but a first sustaining cause. And he tries to argue that this is a divine being. And then later on, Leibniz developed another version, which is known as the contingency argument, right? So Leibniz tries to argue that the contingent things which we observe around us, things that could have been different, they are dependent on other things, and ultimately they must be dependent on the necessary being. And Leibniz tried to argue that this necessary being is a divine being. Right, so broadly speaking, there are these few types of cosmological arguments, right? So there is a Thomistic version that tries to show that there is a sustaining first cause, and then try to deduce that this first cause is a divine being. And then there's a contingency version, which tries to show that there is a necessary being, and tries to show that this necessary being is God. And then there's a Kalam version, which tries to show that there is a first cause of the first event, of the beginning of the first event, and try to deduce that this first cause is a divine being.
So we've touched upon a few different types of cosmological arguments, and you specialized in the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Can you tell us perhaps some of the reasons for what is the Kalam Cosmological Argument, how it's presented, and perhaps what made you choose to specialize in that argument over the rest?
So as I mentioned just now, the Kalam argument tries to show that there is a first cause of the beginning of the first event. Now, this argument is classically formulated by William Lane Craig as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. And then it follows logically from these premises that therefore the universe has a cause. And then Craig will go on to show that the cause of the universe can be deduced to have the properties of being a personal creator of the universe. So this argument is very intuitive, right, in that sense. Very easy to understand. And the reason why I prefer the Kalam arguments is because it can show very clearly why the cause of the universe is a personal creator, that it has to, because from the premises of the Kalam, it can be deduced that this first cause will have to have libertarian freedom in order to bring about the first event. And so it is something that has libertarian freedom would be a personal creator. And so it does arrive at the conclusion that there is a personal creator God. Whereas in the other cosmological arguments, like say, for example, the Thomistic version, which tries to show that there is a pure act, right? But it doesn't actually show why think that this pure act is a personal God. It seems like it can also be something impersonal. And likewise, Leibnizian version by itself, right, shows that there is a necessary being, but this necessary being might not be a personal God as well. So so why believe that this necessary being or this first cause is a personal God? So I think the Kalam argument by itself is able to answer this question, and that's why I prefer the Kalam version of the argument.
That's a really brilliant presentation, and you kind of demonstrate a few of the things that we'll be discussing in this interview. We'll start off by talking about the causal principle, which you've contributed a lot to, and then later, of course, we will also talk about stage 2 cosmological arguments, that movement from first cause to a god, and that's also a very important element of the cosmological arguments. Now, to get started, one of your main ideas and contributions to academia in this field is your argument for the causal principle. But before we get into that argument, can you just briefly explain to us what is the causal principle and how would you like to define it in your presentation?
So the causal principle is whatever begins to exist has a cause, or depends on the cause, and this is a very intuitive principle, right? Because it's very intuitive to think that something does not come from nothing, and therefore whatever begins would have come from something else, and that something else is at least a necessary condition, right? If not a sufficient condition, means at least a necessary condition for something else to come into existence, because something doesn't come from nothing. And so so that's the causal principle, and I think it is very intuitive and very easy to understand, and it also underlies much of the motivation for scientific discovery, right? So when we discover some events happen or some phenomena they observe, we will want to find out what caused that, isn't it? And so it is a very scientific principle in that sense. It underlies a lot of work that is done in science. So it's a very important principle for science. It motivates people to discover the causal explanations for their observation.
Find beginning as a temporal extension with temporal boundaries. As someone who might view beginning might have that criticism of, I suppose, how can something begin if there is no time prior to that moment of beginning? I suppose the definition that you provide is to, in some sense, to circumvent that objection or that challenge. Can you tell us just a bit more about the definition or usage of the term beginning in your argument?
Yeah, so I define the term beginning by taking into account the consideration that for something to have beginning, it has to have a finite temporal boundary, and it has to have an edge. That rather than say, for example, a timeless phase or a circular loop that can avoid an edge. So that will have to be excluded first before we can say that something has a beginning. And this is important because when we discuss the issue of say, for example, we consider some cosmological models. Say, for example, the model by Stephen Hawking, for example. So he would his his so-called no boundary proposal. So on that model, his universe has a finite extension, but because there's no boundary, it actually has a timeless phase in that sense. So it actually avoids an edge, right? So in that sense, and therefore try to avoid a beginning in that sense. And so my definition of beginning of existence takes that into account, right? And so that is one important reason why I define beginning of existence in that way.
Now that we have the framework of causation and of course the definition of beginning in mind, let's turn to now your modus tollens deductive argument for the causal principle, which is quite surprising to some people who may have just briefly heard about the Kalam cosmological argument previously, because they might thinking that the Kalam principle is purely an a posteriori argument or an inductive one, but now you provide perhaps a more deductive modus tollens one. Can you present to us what this argument is and also the ways in which you can argue for this causal principle in a deductive fashion?
So here I clarify that if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, the conclusion is true, right? This follows from the laws of logic. So in my defense of the Kalam argument, I try to avoid using terms like intuition, right? Because different people may have different intuitions, right? Although I do think that the causal principle is very intuitive, as I explained just now. But I try to avoid just by merely depending on intuition, right? So I try to make the argument more rigorous. And a deductively valid argument with true premises is the most rigorous kind of proof that you can provide. It is more rigorous than inductive argument, right? Because we know that there are some problems with inductive inference. And inductive inference does not always guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion, right? It can give probabilistic reason for thinking that the conclusion is true, and that is pretty helpful, but it's not as rigorous as the. Whereas a deductive proof is a proof in a strict sense, right? Because if the premises are true, you can be definitely sure, 100% sure that the conclusion must be true, right? And so this is the strongest kind of proof that you can offer. This will be a sound argument, right? If it is deductively valid and the premises are true. And I do think that such an argument can be formulated for the causal principle, right? So it takes the form of a modus tollens, as you mentioned just now. So modus tollens is if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? So it's deductively valid, and therefore if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay, so I formulate my argument for the causal principle in this way. Premise one, suppose if something begins uncaused, right? Say X begins uncaused, then some other things, such as, say, for example, Y, which begin or could begin to exist around us, cause. Now, why I think that this premise is true? If X begins uncaused, is that there will not be any cause, which makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin uncaused, right? I mean, this follows from the meaning, from the definition of the term of what it means to begin uncaused, right? There will be no cause that makes it the case that only X rather than Y begins. And the properties of X and the properties of Y, which differentiate between them in the concrete world, will be had by them only when they have already begun to exist, which means that they cannot make a difference, right, before they begin to exist. And so what this implies is that there will be no difference between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, given that the circumstance around us is compatible with the beginning of Y, right? The circumstance around us doesn't prevent Y from beginning to exist. And given that any properties that differentiate X and Y will only be had when they already begun, right? They can't do the work of differentiating between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned before they begin to exist. And so what this means is that there will be no difference between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. And therefore, if X begin uncaused, Y would also begin uncaused, right? Because there will be no difference between them where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. However, premise 2 says that it is not the case that Y begins uncaused. Right? So for example, we don't experience a sudden increasing in strength of electric field begin uncaused around us and killing us, right? Because you are still alive, right? Okay, so you know that that is not the case. And therefore, you can know that it is not the case that something or anything begins uncaused. So this follows deductively from the premises. And so I already explained why the premises are true, and therefore the conclusion must be true. And so what this implies is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. It will depend on the cause to make the case that it is, say, X rather than Y that begin to exist. And this is what I mean by the causal principle.
Or in response to the causal principle, some people may appeal to the idea of brute facts. So they might say, okay, well, if X begins uncaused and Y does not begin uncaused, they might say, well, the reason for that is just purely a brute fact. What would be your response to the possibility of brute facts and that objection?
So I already explained just now that it cannot be a brute fact that just X begins uncaused and Y begins caused. Why? Because, as I said just now, given the reasons I presented, right, that any properties that differentiate between X and Y will only be had by them when they already begun to exist, which means that there will be no difference, right, between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. Okay, given that there's no differentiation, they will be the same, right? So you cannot just say that it's a brute fact, right? Because given the reason I presented, it cannot be a brute fact, because given that there will be no difference, they will be the same, right? So that follows from the premises of my argument, and so a brute fact doesn't rebut the reason I have given, right? Which shows that there will be no difference, and therefore they will be the same where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, and therefore we can know that if X begins uncaused, Y would also begin to exist uncaused as well. Yeah, and so that's the first point. Actually, I do have other arguments as well, right? So
Yes.
the second argument, so the first argument follows from deduction, right, from the meaning of the terms, right? It shows that if there's no
Yes.
difference, then they will be the same, right? Where beginning to exist uncaused, where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned. Now, the second argument is a probabilistic argument, right? So it will be overwhelmingly unlikely that out of so many events, only X begins uncaused and Y does not begin uncaused after so many years as a brute fact, right? So given that that there is only X, but no other events around us or whatever for so long time begin uncaused, that it cannot just it'll be extremely unlikely that this is just a brute fact, right? So there would have to be something that makes a difference that explains why that only X, but not other things beginning to exist uncaused, right? So this will be a probabilistic reason, right? Argument against the hypothesis. Yeah, so I think any one of these two reasons I given will be good enough to rebut the brute fact hypothesis. Yeah. So yes, and so we should reject the brute fact hypothesis.
Now, another, I guess, a suggestion that you do raise in your book, and you seem to move on to a second modus tollens argument about the initial state of reality, and you write that some people may appeal to the idea that after the initial state has begun uncaused, some concrete substance would prevent things from being uncaused. Can you tell us how you would then develop that initial modus tollens argument to the second one, and the presentation of that second modus tollens argument?
Yeah, that's right. So some people have suggested that, well, maybe after the universe began to exist, the universe or some substance in the universe may prevent, right, other things from beginning to exist uncaused within our universe. Now, I do have two responses to this objection, and one of them is what you mentioned just now, right? The second version of the modus tollens. But let me defend the first version first, right? Because I think the first version can also be defended against this objection. And my response, so I have two responses, right? So the first response is to ask, how can anything how can anything be prevented from happening? Now, obviously, in order to prevent Y from happening, Y cannot be prevented by something else acting on Y itself, right? Since if Y had already existed, then it has not in fact been prevented, right? You cannot prevent something when it has already happened, isn't it? So and therefore, in order to prevent something else from happening, right, you need to act before it began to exist. And therefore, in order for a substance or anything to prevent Y from beginning to exist, uncaused or caused or whatever, um, X or the substance will have to act on the conditions which are causally necessary, right? The conditions which are which exist before the beginning of Y. You have to act on conditions which are causally necessary for the beginning of Y, or act on the circumstances, surrounding circumstances, in order to make them incompatible with Y beginning to exist. So let me illustrate with a concrete example. So, for example, I see a moving battery operated toy car, okay, moving, coming towards me, coming. It was outside my room, right? But it's coming inside. It's coming closer to my room, and it's going to enter into my room. Now, in order to prevent the toy car from entering into my room, I will have to either remove the causally necessary conditions for the toy car coming into my room. Also, for example, I can remove the batteries, right, from the toy car such that it doesn't come into my room, or I can make the circumstance in my room in such a way to make it incompatible with the car coming in. Right. So, for example, I can fill my room with hard objects, like I can close the door or whatever, and block the car from coming in. Right. So these will be two ways I can do to prevent something from happening. Right. Now, however, if our universe begins, or X, if X begins uncaused, what this implies is that there will be no causally necessary condition, which makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin to exist. And as I already explained just now, any difference between X and Y would be had by them in the concrete world only when they had already begun to exist. That is, before X begins to exist and before Y begin to exist, there cannot be any unique properties of X and any unique properties of Y which makes one different from the other in the concrete world, such that X begins uncaused, but Y-type things is caused to exist. And since there's no differentiation, they will be the same, where the requirement for causally necessary condition is concerned. Okay, and so as I said just now, what this means is that Y would also not require any causally necessary condition, right? And moreover, I also explained just now that the circumstance around us is in fact compatible with Y beginning to exist. And so what this means is that the beginning of the uncaused beginning of Y will not in fact be been preventable, right? Because as I said just now, in order to prevent something from happening, you will have to remove the causally necessary you will have to remove the causally necessary condition, or make the circumstance incompatible with the beginning of Y. But neither of these holds, right? As I already explained, right? So because Y wouldn't need Y, the beginning would not need causally necessary condition, and the circumstance is compatible with Y, and therefore we would expect Y to begin uncaused as well. So what this means is that the uncaused beginning of Y would also not be preventable, and therefore the objection fails, right? So yeah, so that is my first response to the objection. Now, my second response to the objection is, as you said just now, right, there is a second formulation of the modus tonus argument, and it concerns the beginning of other space-time entities um, alongside the initial entity. So what I'm saying is that if our universe began uncaused, then there would also be other universes or other possible space-time blocks beginning uncaused alongside our universe as well, right? Given that there will be no cause that makes it the case that only this universe but not other universe begin to exist, and any difference between them will be had by them only when they have already begun to exist, right? And the circumstance doesn't prevent other universes from beginning to exist uncaused alongside our universe, and therefore, if our universe began uncaused, other universe will also begin uncaused alongside our universe. In fact, all kinds of logically possible universe would begin uncaused alongside our universe as well, right? Because there'll be no constraint, right, that restrict to our universe. And if that's the case, right, what we will expect to see is that this logical, all kinds of logically possible universe will begin to exist uncaused together, and they will bump into each other, they will collide with each other, they will destroy each other, and they will leave behind very obvious effects on our space-time, right? So, for example, in the cosmic microwave background radiation, right, we should see very obvious traces of other universes bumping into our universe and disrupting our cosmic microwave background radiation in a very obvious way. But that's not the case, right? And therefore, we can know that it is not the case that our universe began uncaused.
So you've presented two very powerful arguments for the causal principle, and I think, at least to me, I can't think of any objections, or at least initial objections that one may have to them. But just in case the viewer is trying to use these causal arguments to support their usage of the Kalam cosmological argument, what are perhaps some objections, other objections that they can anticipate to respond to the argument, the two arguments that you've provided?
Well, I have already responded to all the other objections in my books. Um, well, we can maybe briefly talk about some of these objections that some people may have suggested, right? So, for example, some people have suggested that, well, maybe after the universe began to exist, there may be some laws of nature, such as the law of conservation of energy, for example, right, which will prevent other things from beginning to exist uncaused in the universe, right? But as I already explained just now, this kind of objection cannot work, right? Because as I already explained just now, the beginning of Y will not, in fact, be preventable, and the laws of nature is just an abstract description of what um, usually happens, right, in our universe. The laws of nature is not something concrete, right? It's not something that can have some powers to prevent something else from happening. It's just something abstract. And in any case, it cannot prevent Y from beginning to exist uncaused, as I already explained just now, right? And therefore, it is useless to appeal to some kind of law of nature to do the job of preventing Y from beginning to exist uncaused if X begins uncaused. Um, so uh, and so what I mean is that what I'm trying to show is that if X begins uncaused, then Y will also begin uncaused, and the law of nature cannot prevent that. On the contrary, the law of nature would fail, right? Because, as I said, the law of nature is just an abstract description of events that happen. And so if we and so if events keep on beginning to exist uncaused around us, all the laws of nature will fail actually, right? Because they will not work, right? Because our universe will be utterly chaotic if that's the case. And so you cannot use the laws of nature to rebut my argument. On the contrary, my argument shows that in order for the laws of nature to hold, right, the causal principle uh, needs to be true as well, right? So that is my response, right, to this objection. Um, and there are some other people who have suggested that concerning my second modus tonus argument, right, about why we don't see more universes beginning to exist uncaused alongside the initial universe. So Richard Carrier, for example, in his recent debate with me, he suggests that, well, that's because there are some constraints or some scientific reasons, okay, why that is not the case, okay. However, you cannot appeal to science, right, to rebut my argument, because those scientific reasons will only hold, and in fact, they apply to a situation where it, the causal principle holds. So those scientists which talks about multiverse, for example, right? Nowadays, as you know, many scientists are talking about multiverse, and in fact, they are trying to look for any scars on the cosmic microwave background, right, of any other universes that may have collided, maybe in a very slight way, right, with our universe. And so there are a lot of scientific papers about that, right? But those models, they do not claim that the causal principle is violated, right? So if there are multiple universes, they would happen in a way that is in accordance with the laws of nature, right? Which means that it will have to be in a highly ordered way, right? Otherwise, if they bump into each other in an unconstrained way, it'll be totally chaotic. As I said, the cosmic microwave background will be totally disrupted. And so those scientific papers, they are not claiming that the causal principle is violated, though they appeal to laws of nature. However, what my argument has shown is that if the causal principle is violated, then there'll be no constraints, right? As I explained just now. And therefore, the cosmic microwave would be very different if that is the case, right? But that is not the case, right? And therefore, we can know that the causal principle is in fact not violated, right? It must hold as a metaphysical principle.
So that's a brilliant presentation of the causal principle. And of course, there's kind of two aspects of the Kalam argument, the causal principle, and also, of course, as you've previously said, the infinite regress. Now, turning to the argument for a finite regress and arguments against an infinite regress, a lot of people, at least post kind of the development of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory and kind of infinite sets in mathematics, a lot of them have said, well, okay, there might seem to be some initial problems with infinite regresses in the world, or at least in theory, but at the same time, in maths, they might say infinite regresses or infinite sets are everywhere. So in relationship or in conflict between the conceptual infinites and the concrete infinites, what would be some responses to that?
The most important point I want to emphasize in today's interview is that the Kalam argument does not depend on rejecting the possibility of actual infinities. Okay? And this is a very important point I want to emphasize. Why? Because a lot of people have a lot of misconception or misunderstanding about the Kalam argument. They think that the Kalam argument is dependent on, say, for example, the argument against actual infinities. But actually, that's not true, right? Because there are actually multiple independent arguments there are multiple independent arguments against infinite regress, and the Hilbert-Hotel argument is only one of these arguments. And therefore, even if the Hilbert-Hotel argument is rebutted, it does not mean that the Kalam fails, right? Because the Kalam is not dependent on these arguments, right? Because there are other arguments that a proponent of the Kalam can use to argue against an infinite regress. Okay, so and one of these arguments, and by the way, let me just also briefly say something about the Hilbert-Hotel argument as well, right? So again, there's also a lot of misunderstanding about the Hilbert-Hotel argument as well, right? So a lot of people think that it requires a rejection of set theory of or mathematical infinities, but actually that's also not true, right? Because we can distinguish between abstract actual infinities and concrete actual infinities. So the proponent of the Kalam, or the proponent of the Hilbert-Hotel argument, right, to be more precise, can argue that abstract actual infinities is possible, right? You can play around with them in the realm of mathematics, in the abstract realm. But that does not mean that that does not mean that actual infinity can exist in the concrete reality, right? And in one of my books, God and Ultimate Origin, in chapter 2 of my book, I argue that if actual infinity were to exist in the concrete realm, it would entail the violation of necessary truths concerning causality, concerning causal powers, right? So for example, if we can imagine, right, if there were to be an infinite number of people and an infinite number of Christmas presents, and if the people grab the presents in a certain way, right, like person one grab present one, person two grab present two, person three grab present three, and they take away all the presents, then of course there'll be zero present left, right? But if they grab the present in another way, right? Say for example, if person one grab present two, person two grab present four, um, and they take away the even number presents and left behind the odd number presents, and they all take away the present, and every person will have a present, right? Just like in the first case, but what is left over will be an infinite number of extra presents, right, in the odd number presents. Okay, and so this violates our understanding of causal powers, right? Because grabbing a present from one position or the other doesn't have any cause. No, it's not like you're creating presents. It's not like you're causing presents, right? If you just grab one present rather than the other, no, it should have no causal power, right, to produce extra presents, right? But if there were actual infinity in the concrete world, that is what will happen. Okay, and so that will violate causality, right? And by the way, that's the main difference between concrete and abstract, right? Because concrete entities have causal powers, abstract entities do not have causal powers. And my argument is that if actual infinity is to exist in the concrete world, it will violate causal powers and therefore result in a contradiction, right, in that sense. And therefore, actual infinity cannot exist in the concrete world. Okay, so that is a brief summary of my defense of the Hilbert-Ortel-like arguments. I respond to various objections in chapter 2 of my book. But I want to emphasize again that the Kalam doesn't depend on this argument, right? So even if this argument fails, there are other arguments that one can offer against an actual infinite regress. And one of the other arguments which I've defended is what I call the argument um, from the viciousness of dependence regress. And I really like this argument. Why? Because it is very intuitive, and all you need is the causal principle. Okay, so I already defended the causal principle earlier on. I already shown that whatever begins to exist depends on the cause, right? To make it the case that it is X rather than Y that begin to exist. And so this idea of dependence can then be used to formulate an argument against the argument that shows that an infinite regress of dependent entities will be a vicious regress. Okay, so to illustrate, right? Suppose you have a series of train cars, and these train cars were initially they were not move, they were not moving initially, and before the last train car began to move, it has to depend on the train car before it to move first, right? In order that the last train car will begin to move. However, before the last train car, before the one before it begin to move, it also need to depend on the one before it to begin to move first, in order that it can begin to move. Now, if that is all there is, then obviously no train car would ever begin to move, right? Because everyone is dependent on the one before it, right? So what you need is there must be a first engine, right? The train car engine, the first puller. There must be something that is relatively independent in that sense, right? So such a thing must exist in order that the train cars can begin to move. And likewise, before I begin to exist, my parents have to begin to exist first, right? So my beginning of existence is dependent on my parents based on the causal principle, right? Because I cannot, no, I would not, no, because it's not the case that I began uncaused, right? So my beginning of existence need to depend on my parents, and my parents' beginning of existence need to depend on their parents. Now, if that is all there is, then obviously none of us will begin to exist, right? Because everyone is dependent on the one before it. And so what is required is that there must be a first cause which is independent, right? Which doesn't depend on something else to bring it into existence, but rather it will have to be something that is uncaused and without beginning, right? Why? Because as I said earlier, as I already proved just now, whatever begins to exist requires a cause, depends on the cause. However, if something has no, then it doesn't require a cause. Then it doesn't need to depend on the cause, right? Because something that has no beginning will be something that has always existed, and therefore doesn't need to depend on any cause. And so, such a first cause must exist, right, in order that other things uh, can exist. And therefore, uh, this is a way to prove that there must be a first cause. And then one can then go on to deduce that this first cause would have to have no would be initially without any change as well. Why? Because it will be initially changeless. Why? Because every change is something that has a beginning, right? Because a change or event is something that happens. So every change is something that has a beginning. Whereas the first cause, as I said, is something that has no beginning, and therefore the first cause cannot be a change, right? It must be initially changeless. And in order for an initially changeless first cause to bring about the first change, it must have libertarian freedom. It must have the capacity to bring about the first change by itself, and also have the ability to refrain from bringing about the first change in order that it can be initially changeless, in order that it can exist initially without any change. And so these two capacity demonstrates that the first cause has libertarian freedom, okay, and therefore is a personal creator. And therefore, we have already shown, right, that a personal creator must exist. And so I think this way of formulating the Kalam argument is very neat, right? Because it doesn't require all the difficult issues about infinities, about whether actual infinity is possible or not. So we can avoid all those discussion. All we need is the causal principle, right? So on the basis of the causal principle, we can deduce that there must be a first cause, and also deduce that the first cause has libertarian freedom, and therefore is a personal creator God, and therefore we have proof that God exists.
So we will definitely get to the stage 2 arguments in a bit, in shortly. Though I was just, while you were presenting, a quick thought came into my mind, which I would like to share with you, just about the potential implications of A theory and B theory of time, or at least because Craig, in his presentation, focuses very heavily on A theory and B theory of time in some of his works. Now, when you're hearing about, or at least argument for viciousness of dependence regress, it seems to work under the idea of an A theory of time, where kind of time is moving into the future, and that causes kind of go backwards in time into the past in a tensed way. But if someone takes perhaps the idea of a B theory of time, that time already is somewhat pre-existing, and that kind of our perspective of change is just kind of purely the movement of one's perspective through that already temporal kind of process, can one then suggest that perhaps instead of needing there to be a first cause or a first idea of an actual mover, rather that the movement already pre-exists kind of slowly through that B theory progression? I was wondering whether that objection kind of makes sense, or how we would respond to it.
Yeah, so this is an objection that Alex Malpass raised in against me in our debates on the cosmological argument. And my response to Alex Malpass is that my argument actually works on both the A theory and the B theory. Why? Because even if the B theory is true, the modus tollens arguments which I presented just now would still hold, right? Even if the B theory is true, my modus tollens still go through, right? It is still the case that whatever begins to exist would need to depend on the cause. And therefore, my conclusion still follows. Now, we need to understand that the B theory of time doesn't actually deny causality. It also doesn't deny dependence. In fact, all B theories agree that, for example, based on our understanding of science, that regardless of whether time is static or dynamic, it is the case that, say, for example, the existence of water in our world is dependent on there being hydrogen being formed in the earlier stage of the universe, right, shortly after the Big Bang. So if there were no hydrogen, there will not be any water. Okay, so this is a basic scientific fact, regardless of whether you believe in the A theory or the B theory, right? So what this means, what this shows is that the formation of water later on is dependent on the existence of hydrogen earlier on, right? And so the hydrogen is a causally necessary condition for the formation of water later on. So this idea of dependence of causality, right, it still holds even on the B theory, right? So even on the B theory, we can still formulate various counterfactuals concerning causality, which means that if the cause doesn't exist, the effect doesn't exist, right? If hydrogen doesn't exist, water wouldn't exist, right? So all these truths remain the same, even on the B theory. And therefore, the B theory doesn't remove causality. It doesn't rebut my argument. You cannot appeal to the B theory to rebut my argument. My argument will still go through. Yes.
That seems like a very good response to the idea of B theory, because of course a lot of people do raise B theory in these discussions.
Yes.
Now, perhaps developing on this idea, are there any, perhaps apart from the Hilbert Hotel paradoxes, are there any other paradoxes of the infinite which would support the case of a finite past, and how do these eliminate different elements of infinite regresses and their problems?
Yeah, that's right. So I mentioned earlier on that there are multiple independent arguments against infinite regress. So I really briefly mentioned two, right? The Hilbert Hotel argument and the argument against viciousness of dependent regress. And some other people have also defended the Grim Reaper paradox, right? So if your audience are interested, you all can check out the arguments, the books by Robert Kuhns, Alexander Proust. They have defended that argument. But in my books, I have made another unique contribution by defending the argument against the possibility of traversing an actual infinite. Right. So that is another independent argument, right, to show that an infinite regress is not the case. And so, in chapter 5 of my book, the Teleological and Kalam Cosmological Arguments Revisited, I presented my version of this argument against traversing actual infinite, and I defended it against various objections. So to briefly summarize, to briefly present these arguments, um, what I try to show is that if there were an infinite series of earlier events, let's say for example, if the series of actual if the series of earlier events is an actual infinite, then a person, uh, say for example, if there were a person who lived through the infinite series until the present, right? If there's a beginningless person, and this person dropped a marble, one marble every year, he would experience the accumulation of an actual infinite number of marbles in a jar by a step-by-step process, right? If you drop one marble into a jar 1 year, drop another marble another year, and if the past were infinite, he would have experienced the accumulation of an actual infinite number of marbles just by dropping a finite marble followed by a finite marble every year, right? However, that is impossible, right? Because finite plus because plus finite equals plus finite. You cannot. It is impossible to experience the accumulation of an actual infinite by a plus finite process. Okay, because plus finite equals plus finite, and therefore it is impossible, right? That the series of earlier events is infinite, right? Because it will entail a contradiction, as I already explained. So this is a brief summary of my version of the argument against traversing an actual infinite, and it is based on the truth that plus finite equals plus finite. Okay, so again, it's very intuitive and it's very simple, and I have defended the premises of the argument in my book.
Now, someone in response to that might suggest potentially, now I'm thinking just about kind of infinite arithmetic of transfinite numbers, of how you have an A left null plus 1, you get A left null, and kind of the way you start off in order for arithmetically to get infinite numbers is to already have an infinite number already there. I was wondering whether someone might just suggest that perhaps the argument is in some ways begging the question, because it assumes already that the transfinite number is already non-existent in the beginning for those plus ones to be added on to that transfinite number.
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's a frequent objection, right, against this argument. Now, I want to emphasize that my argument is not guilty of begging the question because, as I said just now, it is based on the well-established truth that plus finite equals plus finite, right? So this is something that you can actually prove using mathematical induction, actually. So it is not based on assuming, right, that there is no beginning. It's not based on assuming that there isn't already an actual infinite. Rather, it's based on, as I said, right, plus finite equals plus finite. And so, as I said just now, if you think about the scenario which I mentioned just now, right, about dropping a marble, um, one marble every year. Now, so this is certainly logically possible, right? I can drop a marble this year. I can drop a marble next year. I could have dropped a marble the year before. This is something that is logically possible. And no, and this thought experiment doesn't assume whether there is a beginning or there is no beginning, right? So it doesn't beg the question by assuming that, that there is a beginning, right? So there's no begging the question here. And so the point here is not about whether there is already an actual infinite and then you add one to it or not, but rather the point here is that how could uh, a series be formed by a finite plus finite process in the first place, right? And I already shown that based on our understanding of plus finite, it can only form a finite series. It cannot form an infinite series, and therefore the past couldn't have been infinite. I would also want to add one more point, if I may, concerning the argument against traversing actual infinite. And the one more point I want to add is that argument, one of the other unique contribution I make in my book is that I have also shown that the argument against traversing an actual infinite, that argument can also work on the B theory of time as well, right? Why? Because a lot of people, including even William Lane Craig himself, right? He thought that the argument will only work on an A theory of time, because he thought that this finite plus finite, right? He thought that this will require a dynamic um, view of time, right? But actually, I show that Craig is wrong, actually, because you notice that the way I formulated the argument just now is I'm talking about the experience, right, of the accumulation of a series. And the experience exists, right, regardless of whether this experience is illusory or not illusory, right? Because on the B theory of time, the B theories will say that the experience of time flow is illusory. Um, but regardless of whether it's illusory or not, right, the experience does exist, right? You do experience something being added on the other. And my argument is that this experience itself, right, it cannot involve a contradiction, right? So for example, you cannot experience a shapeless square, right? So even if your experience is illusory, it cannot involve the experience of a logical contradiction, right? And but what I showed just now is that if the earlier events were infinite, it will in fact experience a contradiction, right? You will experience plus finite, forming an actual infinite. But that, as I said, this is impossible, right? It's logically, mathematically impossible, and therefore it cannot be the case, right, that the earlier events are infinite, even if your experience is illusory, right? So, and therefore my argument would hold even on the B theory of time as well. So I explained this point in great detail in chapter 5 of my book, and I'll encourage your audience to check it out about how I respond to all these objections.
I guess in the start of the discussion, when you compared the Kalam cosmological argument to the Thomistic and the Leibnizian cosmological arguments, you argue that the Kalam cosmological argument is in some sense superior because it helps demonstrate a first cause with libertarian freedom in contrast to the other arguments. I was wondering whether you could develop upon that argument more about how you get from the first cause to a personal creator, which we call God.
In chapter 5 of my book, the teleological and Kalam cosmological arguments revisited, I demonstrate that there is a series of, given the causal principle, which I already established early on, right? There is a series of causes and effects, and I also demonstrated that this series cannot be an infinite regress, and it cannot be a causal, it cannot be a circular loop, um, and therefore it cannot be a circular loop because a circular loop will also entail the problem of a viciousness of dependence regress as well, right? So, for example, it's useless, right, to have a train car A depend on train car B, depend on train car C, and depend on train car A. In that case, again, the train cars won't be able to move as well, right? And so it'll be a viciously circular if it was a circular loop, if it's a closed causal loop. And therefore, there's no way you can avoid the first cause, and therefore there must be a first cause. So after you establish this conclusion, you can also use the premises of the Kalam argument to prove that this first cause has libertarian freedom. Now, how? Well, by the ways I suggested earlier on, right? Um, so for example, uh, given the causal principle, the uncaused first cause will have to be without beginning, right? Because the causal principle shows that whatever begins to exist need to depend on cause, whereas the first cause must be uncaused by definition, and therefore the first cause must be something without a beginning. And then we can go on to deduce that the first cause must also be without any change initially. Why? Because a change, by definition, is something that has a beginning, right? So when something change, what that means is that it has gained or lost some properties, and this gaining or losing, right, is the beginning, right, of the change. And so by definition, every change, every event is something that's a beginning. However, I've already shown that the first cause is something that has no beginning, right? And therefore, the first cause cannot be a change. It cannot be an event, right? It cannot be, say, for example, the Big Bang, right? Because the Big Bang is something that has a beginning, right? The Big Bang began 13.8 billion years ago. And so the first cause is not a change, is not an event, rather it is something that is initially changeless, which means that it wasn't changing initially in the initial state. And so we need to ask, how does such an initially changeless first cause, how does it brought about the first event, the first effect, the first change? Now, in order to do that, the first cause must have two capacities. Firstly, it must have the capacity to bring about the first event in a way that is not determined by any prior event or any prior cause. Why? Because the first cause, by definition, is the first, right? So it cannot be the case that something else caused the first cause to change. No, that cannot be the case, right? Rather, the first cause must be able to bring about the first cause, the first event by itself. And secondly, the first cause must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially. So such that because otherwise the first cause would not have been initially changeless, right, without the first event. And so what this means is that the first cause must be able to hold back from causing the first event initially, and yet it must also have the capacity to bring about the first event by itself. And so this dual capacity of holding back and bringing forth describes a kind of freedom, right, that is not determined by prior events, And so the first cause is not something that follow natural laws, for example, right? Because natural law doesn't have this kind of freedom, right? Rather, it is a personal agent, right? It's a personal agent that has this kind of freedom of holding back and bringing forth by itself. And so, and therefore, we have established that the first cause is a personal creator.
That's a very interesting presentation, and you do talk a bit about, I guess, the key aspect of that presentation is the idea of the dual capacity to hold back and bring about the first state of affairs. Now, when, I guess, intuitively, when someone's thinking about the idea of holding back and bringing about, it seems very much that the idea of holding back and bringing about is very much a temporal, in some sense, a temporal relationship. In some sense, I'm holding it back for a certain amount of time before I allow it to be brought about. I was wondering, I guess people who interact initially with the Kalam cosmological argument have the idea of God being temporal, atemporal prior to creation. Well, not technically prior, as William Lane Craig likes to say, but well, before creation. I can't remember exactly how he says it, but atemporal and then entering into the temporal state. I was wondering how you would relate to this idea of the temporal or atemporal nature of God prior to creation.
So there are two different views concerning the relationship between God and time, which can be applied here. So one of the view is what people have called the Oxford School. So you are now in Oxford, you may have heard of this before. Right? So some philosophers at Oxford, for example, Richard Swinburne, he has defended the view that God is always in time. Right? So God may be in a kind of metaphysical time without beginning, before he brought about the first events, right? The beginning of physical time. So while God is in metaphysical time, there is also no change, right? So God is initially changeless in that sense. So that point agrees, right, with what we have established so far using the Kalam cosmological argument. So it could be the case that the first cause was existing in a beginningless metaphysical time without any change. Okay? And so this view would require the substantival view of time. So the substantival view of time basically says that time is like a substance, and it is like a dimension which can exist without any change. Okay, so that is the substantival view. So this is a whereas the relational view of time says that time involves a series of change or events, and so on the relational view of time, there has to be change or events in order for there to be time. And so the relational view differs from the substantival view. And Richard Swinburne's view would require uh, the substantival view, right, in order to work. So that is one approach, right, to this issue. Now the second, and so on this view, you can literally say that the first cause, which has libertarian freedom, right, God, right, exists temporally prior to the first event, right? Because there is a metaphysical time, right? Temporally prior to physical time. Now, however, there is an alternative view which has been defended by William Lane Craig. And on that view, God is without time. God is timeless, sans creation, timeless without creation, and in time with creation. So, on this alternative view, it is not the case that God exists in metaphysical time, but rather God exists without time altogether, in a timeless, beginningless state, right? Because if there's no time, then there's no beginning, right? So that is a second way to think about the first cause and time. And so on the second view, it is not the case that the first cause is temporally prior, right? It's not the case that the first cause is before the beginning, because there's no before, right? Because there's no time before the beginning of time. So that's the difference between the second view and the first view. Now, in my book, in chapter 6 of my book, The Teleological and Kalam Cosmological Arguments Revisited, I have shown that both views are defensible. Okay, so either one will be sufficient, right, to address the possible objections that people may have.
I guess a thought which does come into mind to say God exists timelessly under Craig's view, at least to some might seem somewhat contradictory, because in order for something to exist, I guess the idea of spatial temporal existence might seem to be almost a logical prerequisite for existence to apply.
Oh no, I don't think that's the case, because to exist means to exist means to have properties, right? So if something possess properties, then that thing exists. And the properties doesn't have to be space-time. No, it doesn't have to be in space or in time, right? So we can think of something that exists without space and without time, but yet has properties, right? So, for example, the property of libertarian freedom I explained just now, the property of causal powers I explained just now, and so we can think of God having those properties of freedom or power, and He freely brought about time. Um, that is perfectly conceivable. So no problem. And by the way, I also should clarify a bit more about what we mean by time and how that relates to the Kalam argument. Because as I said just now, right, there are two ways to think about time, right? So one is the substantial view, and the other is the relational view. Okay. So on the substantial view, time is like a dimension. On the relational view, time is a series of events. Now we can think about God. Okay, so let's go the second route, the route that defended by Craig, right? That God was timeless without creation. Now, we can think about that as saying that so if we hold to the substantial view of time, for example, we can think of God existing without any dimension whatsoever, right? Without any substance or dimension of time, and so God will be timeless in that sense, right? He will be existing without that dimension, and then freely brought about that dimension, right? So that makes sense. There's no contradiction there. Now, however, on the other hand, if you hold to the relational view of time, right, time is just a series of events. It also makes sense, right? There's also no problem. I mean, we can think about God existing initially without any events, without any change initially, but he does have the property of libertarian freedom, right? So he has the ability to bring about the first change, and that will be the beginning of time. So again, on that view, again, there's no problem, there's no contradiction. So that's why I said either view is defensible, and on either view, there is no incoherence or contradiction in saying that God exists without time, and then He brought about time.
There has been a lot of work written on the Kalam Cosmological Argument in recent years and in the past by a lot of scholars. What do you think are some of the frontiers, and what are some of the directions of the Kalam Cosmological Argument going forward?
I think more work can be done in engaging with the pre-Big Bang cosmological scenarios, which nowadays many cosmologists are proposing. Okay, so what I want to highlight is that um, now sometime earlier on, a lot of people may have thought that the Big Bang was the beginning of space-time. So that is the standard Big Bang model. But however, nowadays, a lot of cosmologists are talking about pre-Big Bang scenarios, right? So that there could be other universes or other quantum states or whatsoever, or other physical states which may have existed before the Big Bang, right? So we shouldn't just simply assume that the Big Bang is the beginning of all physical reality, right? So that is now being challenged by many scientists, and that's the reason why when I present the Kalam cosmological argument, you will notice that I didn't appeal to the Big Bang, right, to support my premise, right? I didn't say that, oh, because of the Big Bang we know that space-time have a beginning. I didn't say anything like that, right? So rather I base my defense of the premise on deductive arguments, right? To deduce that there cannot be infinite regress. And so those arguments are not dependent on the Big Bang. And so even if the Big Bang is not the beginning of space-time, it doesn't rebut my argument, right? So my defense of the Kalam is not dependent on the Big Bang. Now, having said that, I think it's an interesting exercise, right, to engage with what scientists are discussing. They have been proposing all kinds of fanciful ideas about pre-Big Bang models, although none of those are proven, right, because scientists still do not have a well-established theory of quantum gravity yet, right? So quantum gravity is an attempt to try to reconcile the apparent contradictions between general theory or between theory of relativity and quantum physics, right? Because they seem to be in conflict. And so many scientists have suggested maybe string theory or loop quantum gravity. They have proposed many fanciful ways to try to reconcile these two. But none of this is established, right? And so scientists are still trying to figure this out. But my argument is that regardless of whatever science discovered in the future, the Kalam argument would still hold. Okay, why? Because as I said earlier on, if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay, and I have already explained why the premises of the Kalam is true, right? And for example, I already explained why the causal principle is true, right? And I also use a deductive argument, right? Is deductive the modus ponens argument I have defended is deductively valid and the premises are true, and therefore we can know for sure that whatever begin to exist has a cause. And so using this causal principle, as I said, is enough, right? From there, you can deduce that there must be a first cause, and the first cause being a personal creator, and therefore the Kalam argument cannot be refuted, okay? Because the premises are true, and we can be sure that the premises are true, as I already explained earlier on, and the deduction is valid. Okay, so and so regardless of what science discover in the future, uh, the Kalam argument would still hold, right? There must still be a first cause creator, and in any case, regardless of what science discover in the future, we can always ask, where did that come from, right? So if scientists discover a new law of nature, for example, we can ask where did that law of nature come from, right? And when we ask where did something come from, we are actually asking about cause and effect, right? Where did that come from? What is the cause of that, right? So if you ask where did I come from, I say it came from my parents, right? So my parents is the cause of me, for example. And so whatever science discover in the future, we can always ask where did that come from? And ultimately, as I said, right, as already demonstrated, there cannot be an infinite regress of cause and effect, and therefore, ultimately, everything must have come from the first cause, right? And we can deduce that the first cause is a personal creator. And that's the reason why, no matter what science discover in the future, it can never rebut the cosmological argument, right? It must have ultimately came from God, the first cause. Okay, so that's the important point I want to emphasize. And the second point I want to emphasize is that, a lot of scientists, a lot of cosmologists, they have a lot of misunderstanding about the cosmological argument. They think that the cosmological argument is based on intuitions or based on common sense, but science have shown that common sense is not reliable, right? Science has shown that intuitions can fail too. And that's the reason why many scientists are very skeptical about the cosmological argument. Now, however, have already responded to this objection by explaining and demonstrating that my defense of the cosmological argument is not based on common sense, it is not based on intuition, but rather is based on deduction and observation, right? Undeniable observation, right? So we don't observe things popping into existence uncaused in front of us, right? And you can use this as a premise of a modus ponens argument, right, to demonstrate that therefore whatever begin to exist has a cause, and using that we can deduce that there's a creator. And so my argument is not based on common sense, it's not based on intuition, it's based on undeniable observation and deduction, and therefore we can know that the conclusion must be true. And in fact, science itself requires deduction too, right? Science also requires deductive reasoning, and science is not the only way to know things, right? So a lot of people have hold to the assumption of scientism. They think that the question of ultimate origins must be answered by science, but that is a fallacious, that is an unproven assumption, right? Scientism is unproven assumption. In fact, it's a fallacious assumption, right? Because scientism cannot be proven by science itself. It is a philosophical assumption and is demonstrably false. And so we shouldn't assume that science can answer this question, right? We shouldn't depend just on science to answer um, questions concerning the origin of the universe. Rather, science and philosophy needs to work together. And I already shown that science itself depends on deductive reasoning and observation, and we can use deductive reasoning and observation to prove that there must be a God. And therefore, if you believe in science, you should believe in God, right? And as I already said, if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, and therefore we can know for sure that God exists, right? And so this will be my response, right, to these scientists. And I think in the future, I hope to see more scholars continue to discuss the cosmological argument in relation to what these scientists are talking about. And I think that this will be a good way forward, right, in the future discussion. Yes.
That's definitely a very fascinating presentation, and just something just came up to my mind while you were talking about the impacts of quantum mechanics. Sometimes I talk to my friends about it, and they do say, "Well, what if quantum mechanics genuinely?" I guess right now we have limited understanding of quantum mechanics, but what if we genuinely discovered certain things just coming into existence uncaused? I guess as premise two of your premise of your argument suggests, and it was genuinely the case that things did come into existence uncaused. I was wondering, at that point in time, would the argument just be that the real world is just not in line with logical deductive reasoning, and you would posit some form of logical anti-realism, or is it just the case that there is just a gap between the valid deductive reasoning that you provided and the observations of the scientists.
Yeah. So this consideration based on quantum mechanics is a very popular objection to the Kalam argument as well. So my response is, I have a number of points to make in response. The first point is that, as you know, none of the interpretations of quantum physics is proven. Now, there are different interpretations of quantum physics. So there are deterministic interpretation, there are non-deterministic interpretation, and none of this is proven at the moment, right? So there is a Everett's multi-world interpretation, there's pilot wave model, and there's various models that scientists are still working on. And so it'll be a fallacious conclusion to think that quantum physics has violated the causal principle. That is not true at all, right? But on the other hand, we do have an argument to prove the causal principle, as I said, the modus-tollens argument, which I presented just now. And I also want to emphasize again, right, that science itself requires deduction. Science itself also uses modus-tollens, in fact, very often, right? To falsify theories, for example. And I already used the modus-tollens argument to falsify the claim that something began uncaused. And therefore, there's no way that the modus-tollens argument which I presented can be undermined by quantum physics or by any scientific theory, because science itself requires deductive reasoning. Right? Science itself also uses modus-tollens very often. So that's the first point I want to say. And the other point I want to say is that whatever, in fact, it is impossible, right, to prove scientifically that something began uncaused without any causally necessary condition. Why? Because we can only observe the phenomena, we can think about theories, but as I said just now, right, whatever theories, whatever models scientists come up with, we can ask, where did that come from? Could there be some unobservable causes or explanation for those phenomena? And given the limitation of inductive reasoning, right, there's no way science can exclude the possibility that there could be some unobserved cause that explains the phenomena, that explains the result of any experiment, for example. Okay, so that is the principle of underdetermination, because we can always formulate possible, all kinds of possible explanations for the data or the results of science that we observe. And therefore, there's no way that science can prove that something began uncaused. On the other hand, we can prove that it is not the case that something began uncaused using the modus-tollens argument. And therefore, the conclusion is firmly established, right, that the causal principle cannot be refuted by science. It holds, it is true because the premises are true, deduction is valid, therefore the conclusion must be true. The causal principle is true.
Brilliant. So perhaps moving on to the final question of this interview, what books would you recommend someone to read in order to learn more about the Kalam cosmological argument? Any articles or books that people can turn to?
Yeah. Well, so the first books I'll recommend are my own books. Okay, and I've written two books on the Kalam. One is called God and Ultimate Origins, and the second one is called The Teleological and Kalam Cosmological Argument Revisited. And the second book is open access, which means that it's free, right? And so you can download it from, you and your audience can download it from my website. And I want to recommend especially the second book because it replies to it replies to all kinds of objections, right, against the Kalam argument. And it has gone far beyond the work of William Lane Craig, right? So, and this is an important point to emphasize. Why? Because a lot of people today they still think that Craig's version of the Kalam argument is the classic version, is the best version, but it has been subjected to a lot of criticism, objections, and a lot of people thought that because of that, the Kalam argument has been refuted already. Well, that's not true, right? Because the discussion has moved beyond Craig. So myself and other scholars, we have developed the arguments further and make it more rigorous. And so you will see an example of that, right, in my publication, where I show that the objections which have been raised by other skeptics, like for example, Graham O.P., Wes Morriston, Alex Malpass, Daniel Linford, Joe Schmidt, right? These people who are the leading opponents of the Kalam argument. Now, their objections have all been answered in my books and articles, and so I have shown that the Kalam arguments remains unrefuted, right? So, and so I will encourage your audience to check out my book, right, for the latest defense, most cutting-edge, up-to-date defense of the argument against all kinds of objections, and to demonstrate why the Kalam argument is irrefutable. And I also encourage the audience to take a look at my articles on my academia.edu website, where I also provide responses to critics, to people who have tried to rebut the arguments in my book. So, for example, there's a very famous atheist. His name is Richard Carrier. The famous Jesus mythicist, right? He has tried to rebut my modus tollens argument. Well, in response, I pointed out that there are at least 60 errors in his attempted rebuttal, and so his rebuttal utterly failed. So I'll encourage your audience to take a look at my response to Richard Carrier. And also, I'll encourage your audience, you can take a look at my debates with Graham Opie, Daniel Linford, Alex Malpass, and also the debate reviews, which I've done with on other YouTube platforms. You can go to my YouTube channel and take a look at the playlist there. It has a lot of videos on the Kalam arguments, where I show how the objections are answered and why the argument stands unrefuted. And finally, I also would like to recommend a book in Chinese because you and I, we are both Chinese. So there's a Chinese book called 星空背后的真理, right? The Truth Behind the Universe. There's an ebook version which can be purchased online, and I will recommend it to you as well. And you can share it also with people from mainland China. I think that there's quite a number of students from China at Oxford, for example, and many people from mainland China, they may be atheists, Marxist atheists, right? So I think we can share these resources with them, right, to help them see that there are good reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God who created the universe. And I think that would be very helpful for them and for other people as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for introducing those books, and I'll put a link to Andrew Loke's channel in the comments below, and also to his works there as well. Thank you so much for coming onto this channel. If you enjoyed this video and want more interviews where I discuss leading ideas in philosophy with leading scholars, then make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see me discuss and interview next in the comments there as well. Thank you so much. See you soon, and God bless. I'll see you next one.